One of the big things I would change about The Walking Dead is when Carl Grimes died. I was never even really overly keen on Carl. I liked him in the earlier seasons. He was a kid acting like a kid. A realistic take of a kid in a zombie apocalypse. In the Walking Dead shows now, they're like animatronic, so I've learned to appreciate it. After season 6, I just didn't care for him as much. But one thing was for sure, Carl Grimes should never die. Everything the main character Rick ever did in The Walking Dead was for Carl. In fact, everything great about this character was pending in the comics. It was just a season away, but he died. It was clear at this point that Morgan's time on the main show was coming to an end. From him reliving then coming back out of his all life is precious phase, he built that cell in Alexandria that would inevitably be for Negan, and it would have made so much sense if Morgan died, and that's why Rick spared Negan at the end of the season.
Why? It'll give you some choices next time.
But for some reason, that death that would be the reason that Negan is spared was given to Carl, one of the main points of the show. Why it's even happening. Both Rick and Laurie foreshadowed that he would be the one to go on. In the comics, it was such a meaningful thing that he took over after Rick died. He was a kid that was there from the start to then tell the story, but the show just completely denied that from happening. Some of that legacy has gone on to Judith, because unlike the comics, she's still alive. And although I wasn't totally keen on it, I like the concept, and it makes sense that that's who the torch would next be passed down to. I mean, she actually represents a lot. She was born back at the prison, but they didn't even sustain that for all its cringe because they've created RJ, Rick Jr., a kid Michonne had off screen that Rick has still never met. It feels like some blatant chess piece to the story with zero importance. I don't think he knows where he is. This game of chess could have been avoided if they just gave the legacy to whom it was intended to. So, what if Carl Grimes didn't die? Let's get straight into it, of course. Before we do, make sure you press the like button and make sure you subscribe if you're new. Starting from his death episode, season 8, episode 9, this is the only timeline where Carl Grimes could have survived. For this reality, Morgan built the cell and would later die from a bite, saving Sadiq. So just like what actually happened with Carl, this meant Sadiq lived longer, which meant the communities had a doctor for years, until Dante. Rick spares Negan, because the man he first met in the apocalypse told him that all life is precious, and his mercy should prevail over his wrath. So with Morgan dead, but just before Rick beats Negan, Carl and Henry are at Hilltop. They're both watching the saviors that Maggie's imprisoned. I think it's here we'd see Henry trying to almost be like Carl, but a weaker, more reckless version, an echo of what he was like in season 4. He wants to avenge his brother Benjamin.
Which one of you killed my brother?
Carl is seeing premonitions of when he was younger, when he wanted to kill. He doesn't say which savior killed him. Daryl and his small group return to Hilltop and break the news that Morgan was bitten and just died. But after Carl hears that Morgan passed, the man who once told him to never be sorry,
Don't ever be sorry.
he tells Henry it was Gavin. This was part of Carl almost trying to save Henry, because of course he killed Gavin already when Jared killed Benjamin. He was stopping his need for vengeance right there. Now in the show, when Carl actually died, Rick and Morgan ran into each other and would end up going to hunt down saviors.
Maybe you should be out. Yeah, I'm not going anywhere.
But they got captured by them, and this basically turned into a big slaughter. We saw Rick and Morgan just completely lose it. Rick gave the saviors his word, but they killed all of them.
I'm giving you my word. I lied.
This is one of, if not the lowest point we've seen Rick. With Morgan dead, I think this would have been Carl. As Jared killed Benjamin and Carl sympathised with Henry being this kid that wants revenge, to stop that, he does it himself. He kills Jared. And again, with Rick leaving the next season, this would be the start of Carl seeing how far he's gone. It's nearly his time to essentially take the reins, which, let's be real, should have happened. Before the final act of the war, Michonne tries relaying Morgan's message to Negan to try and stop the war before more people die. And yeah, I think he took it quite well. A year passes after Rick beats Negan. The new beginning story arc begins. Everything is how you first saw it, but Carl is still here, and he looks like he did in the comics at this point. Michonne still does what she does. Judith is even there too. But after Rick leaves, after that time jump, there's not going to be an RJ. We have Carl, so we don't need him. This is my world now.
Did a brave man go to his friend's house after that?
Rick blows up the bridge and, as they think, dies. 6 years have gone by. Daryl and Carl look for any sign of him and his body for months on end. Carol and a now more grown Henry try convincing them to come back, but to no avail, until they do come back when the walkers start talking. When Henry was in the show, he fell back a lot from what Carl actually would have been involved in, even though he took Carl's comic storyline. When Michonne and Daryl capture Lydia, he would have been there with them. The Lydia storyline in the show was literally made, sculpted for Carl, so if he was still alive, he would 100% get that. They even had that thing with Enid and Alden, with Henry getting a bit jealous. That was made for Carl. Although I did like Henry covering it and setting up that Pike reveal, it's still massively appreciated. What a gift. So with Carl getting his comic storyline, who dies on the Pikes in Henry's place? Still Henry. It was a big part of Carol's story, however tedious you think that might have been. It led to Carol being blinded by her need for vengeance and that cave incident. We're creating a timeline with Carl Grimes that stays as close to the canon story as it possibly can. So although Carl is with Lydia getting that comic storyline, Henry's in the background being jealous. He'd be tailing them. He liked Enid just as he liked Lydia, so would have been passively jealous the exact same way and ended up on the Pikes. I think there is a chance that if Carl survived, Enid would have survived too, because she'd have a lot more use. Even though there was potential, in the end she just existed to affect and develop other characters once she died. All she ever did was eat a turtle and make me cringe. She died and turned into XP for Alden. Who's to say if Carl was still alive, she wouldn't have just died too, with her only friends or, you know, connected characters in the show being Jesus, who died, Maggie, who left, and then just Alden. I think by the end of the show, her storyline was to just die and give Alden that whisper of rage, you know, have him take part in the war and sympathise with Gamma later and look after baby Adam for about 10 minutes before he died. I think Enid was just a character that was never truly utilised. It's just more to say that when Carl died, a lot of things collapsed, which is fine, but this is what could have been.
Step back.
But I think it's here we'd see Carl Grimes' real rage against the Whisperers, another character that would have lost a lot from them. So it wouldn't just be Carol blindly chasing vengeance with Alpha, even with everything Carl preached. Because Enid died, it would be Carl too. He didn't just lose Enid, he knows what Lydia had to go through. And of course, at this point, Henry had basically been Carl's trainee in this timeline, the younger version of himself. So I think it'd be quite close to Carol in getting to Alpha. We saw how he got when people died in the show. He wanted to make sure it never happened again. The episode that followed in the season 9 finale was called The Storm, where we saw a snowstorm. At first we see Alden start on Lydia, which I've always found ironic considering he was a saviour, but understandable when Enid's just been killed by her mum.
Is that them? People watching us now, huh? Only followed their rules. Haven't they done enough to us?
Hi. To lay off.
In this situation, Carl would defend her, and then later, when Lydia tries to get herself bitten, Carl stops her. With Carl in the show, Lydia would be a much bigger character, almost like what Andrea was in the comics, but for the show. Because remember, not only did Rick leave, but Michonne left, so it would have been Carl and Lydia holding their place. She wouldn't be some background character that had her arm off just to do something. It would be cool to have a Carl, Negan and Daryl fight with Beta, especially in this timeline where Daryl and Carl are like the new duo. So I think that would happen roughly the same, but just a lot better. You know, Negan got flawed. It would have been really cool to see Negan and Carl both fight against Beta and fighting the other Whisperers and zombies. That is so cool. That hurts to think about, but we did get Daryl saving Negan, which is good in its own way. I think Negan would still kill Alpha, and it would still be Carol sending him, but Carl would just be with Lydia. Halfway through season 10, Michonne meets Virgil, and he claims to have weapons and supplies over on this island. Of course, this turned out to be just him being sick, but she found valuable clues of Rick's whereabouts, with his boots and the phone with the writing and sketches on it. Now, before she went with Virgil, I think Carl would have stayed with Judith and Daryl in the first place, which means in episode 13, when Michonne contacts Judith about following a big lead on Rick, Carl would be the one hearing this and he would offer to come with her, but as she inevitably wants to go by herself, he would immediately tell Daryl. Because what actually happened is Judith didn't tell Daryl. It was frustrating and felt like a massive plot hole. I mean, why not tell the guy that was distraught about Rick and looked for him for the better part of the whole time jump that Michonne had basically found out that he wasn't actually dead? The reason we got is that she didn't tell him because she thought he'd leave too after Michonne already went. It's understandable because she's younger, it's what a kid would do.
Am I gonna die?
And it would obviously be saved for when Daryl did inevitably find out and leave the show himself. But Carl, he would tell Daryl. Now, when it comes to the Reapers and the Commonwealth, I think what happened would stay roughly the same because it was a passive season compared to the comics. It got shrunk down because it basically had to. In the comics, it was the be-all and end-all. In the show, it was impossible for it to do that because it's not the be-all and end-all. With all the shows coming, the spin-offs, and more importantly, Rick, the main character. The scene that comes to mind the most when thinking of Carl existing in the Commonwealth storyline is when Daryl is dressed up as one of the guards, and you've got Hilltop not wanting them to go in. But then Daryl is saying, "Let me in." Which side of the fence would Carl be? He would 100% either be next to Daryl dressed up, or next to Aaron and Gabriel, or completely replacing Elijah. Elijah was so contrived. He got with Lydia too, so I think it's safe to say this is what Carl would be doing, but on a much bigger scale. Because he's Carl. In the show, Dwight's comic death barely happened with Leah, and Rick's comic death, I think, could even be saved for a bigger storyline. They both could. I think Carl probably would have been the one to kill Sebastian or Lance. Killing Sebastian would be like a callback to the comics because Sebastian killed Rick in the comics. With how he was at the end of the show, it would be cool if he was given that job to go out and reach other communities with Aaron and Gabriel. But where would Carl end up? I think it'd go with Daryl. Remember, if he had survived, he would have already been out there with Daryl for years looking for him, so if Daryl's going, this is their mission. So, at the end of The Walking Dead, Daryl and Carl both leave to go and find Rick. And I think, inevitably, Rick and Daryl will reunite. If Carl was still alive, he could have reunited with him too, and I think there'd be a much more justified story. I mean, it makes sense that this kid would go on and be the new leader of the show, and handle everything while Rick is gone. I think killing Carl Grimes is one of the biggest mistakes a TV show has ever made. It was still good after him, but it just made it feel less grounded. Fates in TV shows are meant to be sad and hard-hitting, but this just felt wrong. It felt really off. From the space from episode 9 to the season finale of season 8, it just felt like it shouldn't have happened. Sometimes it feels like what actually happened is the alternate timeline. This is what was meant to happen. As much as I love Morgan and I'm entertained from him in Fear the Walking Dead, I feel like this is where he should have died. It was the right time. Now, I don't know if there is a right time for him. Sometimes it feels novelty. Now, you know me, I'm a piece of filth when it comes to fictional death and crossovers, but I don't think this was the best choice to make. I've always seen this as the point when Carl died and Morgan crossed over, where The Walking Dead lost a bit of itself, but I hope because he didn't die in season 8, whenever his story does end, it's more fitting and hopefully bigger and better than whatever season 8 would have offered him anyway. I want Morgan's story to end reuniting with Rick because I think inevitably he will, and if he's gonna die, have a sacrificial death that saves a lot of people, unless he dies in Fear season 8, which honestly I wouldn't put it past those writers. They could rationalise E.T. being in it at this point. They do what they want or whatever. But I want to be clear, I love Morgan, and I've said before, Fear the Walking Dead as of lately is like an energy drink. It's crappy, but I like it. It just is entertaining. It's not as good as it was since season 3, but I love Morgan. I do like the show. I just feel like The Walking Dead suffers from itself sometimes. It's like in its attempt to do more, it's changed plans and differed from the original plans that there probably were. So that big ending that you would have wanted while watching the show for the first time, the main show didn't have that. It couldn't have that. I think that will now be whenever the end of Rick Grimes' story is. So for example, the end of the Rick and Michonne show. But this is what I think would happen if Carl Grimes didn't die, but we'll never know for sure. What do you think would happen if Carl survived? Would you rather he did? Would you have preferred someone else in his place? Or are you completely okay with what actually happened? Let me know what you think down below. Like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you're new. Got loads more coming. Thank you for watching. I'll see you soon.
Dad, you can't keep me from it.
From what?
From what always happens.
Yeah, maybe. But I think it's my job to try.